So that's a good conversation that I would like to continue, but we need to move back into the meeting now. And I'm also conscious that we are running late, so we'll try and finish at 1:30. So welcome back, everyone. I'm looking forward to hearing what you've been talking about and how it went. And so if we can just walk through the sort of high level, the headlines from each of the 4 groups, that would be really helpful. So I don't know which group wants to feedback first.
I'm glad to go. Gwen, is someone going to share slides, or you want me to? How do you want to handle it? Okay, I guess that answers that question.
Go ahead.
And I can say we're sort of in violent agreement. I think we weren't aware we were going to be so rudely cut off at the end. We were still having a conversation when we went dark. So anyway, let me share some upfront observations with you, and then we do have the prioritization charts. There was strong support for the 2 main projects and the minor projects, which you can see when we got the minor project, we actually were suggesting maybe a switch there. Very strong support for the differential. They think that shouldn't be number 1 based on everything that we're seeing. We have natural resources, and we have a theme of being a little flexible going forward. As we continue to move down natural resources, we may see some projects kind of spin off of that. And so there may be a need to have some flexibility to pick those up as we go forward. We talked a lot about discount rates and the importance of that. It ultimately went below the red line, but only really because of the criteria for project prioritization was kind of forced it down there, but the need would have pushed it higher from that perspective. We're okay with tax expenditures, and we think there's a need for a project for alignment of IPSAS, the conceptual framework, of some individual standards. You'll see that's going to come up again. So if you can go to the next one. That's what I mentioned earlier about flexibility. When you kind of look at 2 years and you look at that map, that map isn't going to stand still during that period of time. So we need to continue to have some flexibility. Again, we support 3 as well. We think it's a good blend between the longer term and the short term. We think that's important to keep going from that. And you're going to see we've added a little more on some natural resources. Another topic that came up was research, and see, it's research. We've actually added a new topic category called research. We didn't totally listen to you. So we have a new category called research. And we think there's some issues with Indigenous people. It's brought up in Canada, but I can tell you it's in the US as well, based on my experience. And then we have distinguishing between capital investment. We think that we may be going to hit that basically on Tuesday, that may be on the project. But so if we can move ahead in the interest of time. So this is where we came out. Understanding, if you add something, you gotta take something off. But we really, the line between discount rates was a big debate. We had above and below several times, but we do think differentiator and financial reporting go together. So what kept those above the line is we think they support each other. And that's why we ended up where we did. The group felt very strong. And by the way, I didn't say it earlier, but 100% of everybody in our group participated multiple times. So this does represent a pretty good cross-section of our conversation. And we felt alignment of the conceptual framework need to be above the line, but what we couldn't decide was which one to move down. So we can tell you it's not 21, but we can't tell you what's 31 or 33. That was where we ended the meeting abruptly. So anyway, that's what we were debating when it all came out. So we actually do think, we think sometimes it's not an or, but sometimes it's an and so the great thing about having Andreas in our group was we could talk about academic research. And plus there was a couple of academics in our group. So obviously a little different conversation, but if I get, as a personal, I played by the rules, and I didn't give any personal bias as a facilitator, but I did make a plea for maybe in the area of sustainability and this could be a way to send a message that is an area we're concerned about, is maybe go with some academic research on this. And we could make it very focused. We understand it's a broad area, but we may want to think about looking for some academic research in that area, particularly some areas that we think would be helpful to us in deliberating. So I think that's it. I think, Renee, is it? Yeah. and our staff did a great job of supporting us the whole time. So
great, thanks for that. And
is that quick enough, Ian? Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And it's interesting that the research point came out, because that's something that, you know, in discussions, Ross and Dave and I had sort of kicked that one around in terms of, and I think we need to think as a board, do we want to actually put a sort of potential research slate out for discussion or not? You know, and so that's interesting that you picked that one up. And certainly, for example, the Indigenous people, you know, that was certainly, and green infrastructure were both topics that came up at the last Public Sector Standards Setters Forum. And I think, you know, certainly, particularly the Indigenous peoples one, I think there is a real question as to kind of what's involved and how does it fit the existing standards. So a sort of research topic might well be quite a good way to get into that. Is there anything else anybody from that was in that group wants to add briefly before I move on to the next group? No, okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Scott, for that. That was really helpful and great to get those headlines. So move on to the next group now. Who wants to go next? Everybody light on this?
I'm happy to, if we can get the
Okay,
slide.
go ahead, Bob.
Is that the right slide?
I think so, thank you. So the Asia-Oceania group had a really good discussion, I think. And
I'm not sure if it's me that I've lost the slide.
slide's gone. Yeah,
Yeah,
I have
right.
it. Here it comes. Good. So I think I'll just talk to this slide. So we had a good discussion around the presentation of financial statements project, and got a good understanding of what that would entail. So, you know, people raised the likes of, you know, as OCI and considering other comprehensive income as that part of the project, as part of the project, sort of looking at principles of disclosure or a disclosure framework. And I think we landed on, yes, it is, because it's a major project, it is covering all of those sorts of things which people had raised. And in thinking about it, we thought that that was probably our number one for major projects. There was also very, very strong support for a differential reporting or IFRS for SME type project, and we didn't see those as different, so we essentially collapsed those two projects into one, because you can't do one without the other. It's a project to determine what you're going to do in that space, but very strong support, because we've got you know, a lot of countries within the region with a lot of public sector entities, and the full suite of IPSASB and having to comply with every last thing, and those isn't necessarily going to lend itself to some of those smaller entities. So, you know, we're very much supporting, I think, the straw man that was put up ahead of the discussion. We decided, in terms of the other major projects, that we would elevate IPSASB 33 ahead of discount rates, and I think in doing that we were very mindful of the number of jurisdictions that are looking to move to accrual accounting, and I think the numbers that we're going to be using IPSASB moved from about 11 to 50 by 2030, so that could be an important project to look at. As part of our discussions on IPSASB 33, there was a question mark, I suppose, as to whether it was a major project or it might fit closer to the minor, but we left it under major, given that was sort of what had been indicated in the papers. And yeah, in terms of discount rates, it really was around the feasibility of doing a major project in that area. In terms of the other major project, which I think was tax expenditure, we were keen to sort of see that removed as a project because the fact that we didn't get any traction through the academic forum and that it doesn't seem to be a big issue, certainly in the Asia-Oceania region, we thought that that could come off. In terms of minor projects, when we sort of talked about impairment, IPSASB 26 came up as part of that conversation, and so we sort of said, you know, if we do a project around impairment, yes, IPSASB 21 is probably the one that most change might be made to, but let's not lose sight of the need to just make sure if we're doing a minor project on impairment that IPSASB 26 may come into the mix. We thought it was important to do a minor project around related party disclosures. I think in a number of jurisdictions in our region, there are some issues that are coming through in terms of that standard and whether we're getting the level of disclosure for transparency that you might expect with the standard as it is currently. And the one that made the cut above the red line was then IPSASB 31 on intangibles that we thought was the next most important. One of the minor projects that you won't see there was the Materiality Judgments, Practice Statement 2, and that was another one that we thought wasn't really a project that we thought was needed, so we decided to remove that. But through discussions, we did have someone raise that IPSASB 32 on service concession arrangements, they had found that there were some difficulties in terms of the interpretation and application of that standard in the jurisdiction. And so we thought that that was probably something that we should raise here. Whether it's a minor project or whether it could be dealt with through an improvement project is something that once we look at the detail, you know, it might be something that could be picked up even through an improvement project, so it may not even make it onto the minor projects list. So that's where we landed in terms of major and minor projects, but there were a few other things that did get discussed, which I just wanted to add on at the end. So there was a lot of support for the natural resources project that we are currently doing, so that was good. There was also a bit of discussion around financial sustainability, particularly in a post-COVID world, which it looks like we might be heading towards with the vaccines now being rolled out. You know, we certainly talked about the fact that we've got the recommended practice guides 1, 2, and 3, which you know, 1 in particular gets into that long-term financial sustainability, but management discussion and analysis and service performance reporting certainly supporting some of the discussion we had in that area. And the last matter that I wanted to raise was that there was a bit of discussion around really the need to get some KPIs, so key performance indicators for public sector entities. We decided it wasn't something that we needed to put on the project prioritization list, but it's certainly something that might lend itself to academic research or to be thought about in terms of our streams D and E in terms of our strategy. So I think that probably summarises what was a very good hour of discussion, and I think we were running down to about the last minute to pull all of that together.
That's great, thanks Todd, and I'm amazed how much you've actually managed to cover in an hour in both those discussions. Anybody else in that group, is there anything that Todd didn't bring out in that feedback? I mean, obviously we have got the discussions recorded so that staff can review what was said in moving things forward, so they'll use that. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. You did really well. But I just wanted to clarify the KPI discussion was around financial KPIs rather than service performance reporting. That right, Todd?
So, okay, yep. Great, okay. So I think then it's either Lynn or Lindy next.
I'm happy to go if that helps.
Yeah.
Seeing that my internet connection seems okay at the moment, I might take advantage. So we did, so we had a good discussion. We learned a lot about each other, that we all like going to restaurants, and quite a few of us like going up and down mountains. But on to the topics in hand. We did have quite a lengthy discussion on potential projects to add. And I guess in that discussion, as you can see on the slide here, there was quite a discussion that we had around operating segments and segmental reporting. And I guess we wanted to flag its importance, but although we did have a discussion on Tuesday about this topic, and we don't know where we're going to end up on that, but if that did not end up as a topic addressed as suggested by Tuesday, then we think it is a project to add here. So we wanted to flag that. Equally, we had a bit of a discussion around other potential projects to add, and in that we wanted to emphasize, I guess, the importance of the sustainability agenda and sustainability reporting. So we did sort of debate that, although clearly we'd made a decision just prior to going into the breakout sessions. We also had a bit of discussion around alignment of the conceptual framework and the literature, and whether there were areas where those didn't align that ought to drive us to adding a project to the list of potential projects. There were two main elements of that. One was about elements and one was around recognition, but having then debated it further, we didn't have an appetite to add a recognition project to the project agenda. We just merely ended up noting that that wasn't something that we had the appetite for. There were two other areas that we discussed as potential projects. One was around what we called sort of aggregation, or the group accounting boundary, and where control and how control operates in the public sector. And then the final area of potential projects that we identified was whether or not there was a project needed or would be useful around IFRS 17 alignment. So we did have quite a debate on potential future projects. And what we did was then to sort of, when we were doing our ranking of projects, major and minor, we sort of checked in with ourselves about whether or not any of those identified areas would replace the ones that we put above the line. Whilst they didn't, I guess I'm struck with what Scott had done in the Americas group around, well, are they potential research areas? If they're not going to make our project list, then could there be more research that's usefully done, given that we did flag those? So if we move on to the next slide, the great reveal, in terms of the red line and where we ended up. So we did have differential reporting was kind of like the #1 project for most people in the group, and that's how we did our ranking. We sort of said if you had which would be your #1 project, and most people voted for differential reporting as the #1 project, and that was one ahead of discount rates. I guess on discount rates, we didn't have a lengthy discussion on it. My observation would be that in the discussion that we did have, we thought it was important to note the comments that were made before we went into the breakout session, that this was when a project would start, not necessarily when a project would end, because we could see that this could be a major project that would take a significant period of time, but it did command support above the line in the group. And then you can see sort of the ranking order after that in terms of the ones that tied presentation and first time adoption, with tax expenditure not gaining any support in the group. In terms of the minor projects, again, you can see where we landed on that. There was a slight debate about intangibles and materiality judgments, which order, but we ended up with debating and putting intangibles straight after impairment. And so that's where we ended up. I guess that's my summary.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lynn. Anything else to add from anybody who's in that group? I mean, I think one of the other things that does come out from the discussions is clearly we're going to need to provide a better, for the projects we propose, we're going to need to provide at least a better description of what the scope, the potential scope of those would be. Because you can see some resonances between the various different discussions about what's in this and what's in that and how do they fit and so on. So the more we can provide some help there. And I think also it's beginning to feel like we should say something about a potential research program as well. That feels like that's a sort of way of communicating the importance of topics, even if we're not proposing immediately to add something to the list. Okay, so last but not least, Lindy, over to you and your group.
Thank you very much. And it's quite interesting. You'll see a lot of similarities between our group and the one before this. Maybe the Lynn and the Lindys were aligned. So thanks a lot. When we opened the discussion, we were wondering where the board would land on IPSAS 18 I4A discussion and wondered, okay, well, we don't want it to be lost and it should then pop up here. But what we did think and had quite a long discussion is I think we do need to understand what the problem is or what we would address, and thought that perhaps this would be an interesting research project or a post-implementation review exercise, kind of just to understand, well, what is the resistance, what are the implementation lessons that we've learned, so that it wouldn't be something that would just be taken on, but I think it would be backed up by some further research or looking into. The emissions trading scheme wasn't something necessarily to add, but it was something for the task force or the board to consider, what happened to this, because there are some linkages to the natural resources project. There was some work done previously on it in conjunction with the IPSASB, but I think because they stopped their project, we didn't pursue it. And I guess it was just a question to ask, isn't this something that we should pick up and look into? And so it landed here. We didn't identify something to remove, but what we did discuss is that although, because we felt that if we remove something, it might look like we don't want to do it, and it's just about prioritization. So there was nothing identified to be taken off or struck from the role. Thanks. Can we move to the next one? So here is our view. And you'll see we maybe move between major and minor projects in the classification thereof. So what came out clearly was the differential reporting project that should be undertaken. Linked to that would then be, we felt that if you're going to do differential reporting, you should be doing something on materiality, because we see it as quite an important link, because often, the suite of standards could be perceived as being very complicated, but actually materiality is important in making your assessments on accounting policies and disclosures. We did have quite a big discussion on the IFRS for SMMEs and where it would fit into that, but I think it depends then on what decisions are made in the differential reporting. So if that project is undertaken, you would consider the IFRS for SMMEs in making decisions. But certainly we weren't too sure if it should be something that should come onto the radar. I think it is an outcome of that project, but certainly link the materiality to it. Discount rates was then important, and that's from many jurisdictions that are currently implementing the standards are struggling with it, and the guidance on that would be very important. And then underneath that was, I guess it was a close, the presentation of financial statements and tax expenditure. We did discuss tax expenditure, and we did wonder if perhaps there could be something, disclosures could be introduced through the revenue standards potentially, or it could actually be subsumed into the presentation of financial statements projects. But I mean, they were still important to us, but that's kind of where they landed in terms of that ranking. Moving into the minor projects and the second table, we've discussed materiality. We did think that keeping the momentum with IPSAS 21 and 31 was important. You might be surprised to see the ranking of the IPSAS 33, especially from this group. But what we felt there was that, first of all, the standard can be quite, I think it could be useful for a lot of jurisdictions, but I think in a lot of instances, jurisdictions decide their own path and decide their own kind of standard for first-time adoption. And secondly, and probably more importantly, we thought, well, I think it is important for us to make progress or finalize the project on, what did we call it now? Pathways to accrual accounting, and kind of see what comes out of the revised study 14, if there would be something that we would pick up from there. So kind of thought, well, let's wait a bit for that project to at least complete, and then maybe see if there's anything that should come into the standard. And then on related parties, I think we also saw that kind of in the same bucket as IPSAS 18, you know, kind of, I think it is a very challenging jurisdictional thing in terms of what is related parties, what are key management personnel. So we put it there as something to look at, but it might also be something that we would want to think about in terms of what are the issues, what are the concerns before we actually go into this project. Yeah, so thanks. That's where we landed on these.
Great, thanks, Lindy. So I think that's been a really interesting range of discussions. Does anybody at this stage want to just raise an issue or ask a question in terms of one of the other debates in a group that you weren't in? Okay, I think we're moving towards the end of the session, actually. I mean, I think you can see some clear, you know, projects clearly receiving common support, and I think differential reporting, you know, stands out that we, you know, that's something that, you know, looks pretty definite that should be on the list. You can see some questions about, you know, should we take forward discount rates? Should we take forward presentation of financial statements? If you looked at that that long list, clearly other things are on some lists and not on other lists. So I think that's where the task force is going to need to sort of sift through what's you know, those projects which have received support from one group, not from the other, and so on. I think we need to listen to some of those discussions, you know, in terms of taking the process forward. From the staff side, Dave or Ross, are there any things you want to, you know, questions or whatever you want to ask, or then do you want to take us into next steps? Ross?
One point that kind of comes through that I think is interesting that I think we should do in our analysis, particular on the research projects. We discussed those at the regional roundtables in 2019, and a couple of the findings from the regional groups, to me, don't line up exactly with what we heard at those roundtables. So I think we should go back to some of that analysis and kind of bring that into our discussion as we develop the outcome of the groups. So the one that jumped out to me is, I remember the roundtable in Addis, when we were talking about the research program, there was questions on discount rates, and that from many participants that they were still on cash. It wasn't a big issue for them. They were more concerned with getting on to accrual. So I think we probably need to balance the needs of the constituents and think through the project. So that was one that stuck out, because I remember getting a particular strong message from a couple tables on that one. But I think that it's an important aspect we shouldn't lose, because we have talked to constituents about the research projects.
Thanks, Ross. Dave, anything specific from you at this stage?
No, nothing specific for me.
Okay, so should we just remind ourselves of next steps on this? Dave, perhaps if you can just remind us what happens next on that.
So our next touch point is, I think it's next Monday, we're going to the PIC and we'll give them an update of our process. It's important we loop them in because this is part of our due process. Coming out of these breakout sessions, we will convene with the task force. I suspect we'll do that twice. One is to debrief what we just talked about, and one is to give them first sight of the mid-period consultation document. Then we hope to, by mid-May, have an in-period meeting with the CAG and then reassemble the breakout groups we just had, so everyone can take another look at a first look at the consultation document, so that as we move into June, everyone's had a good opportunity to take a look at the document, and we're looking at a well-reviewed document as we move into June.
Great. Okay. Thanks for that, Dave. And I would say to everyone, thank you very much for all the input to those discussions. They really sound great, really rich discussions. And also, I must admit, you seem to have coped extremely well with, there was a lot of input beforehand that we felt was needed to set those discussions up. So thanks very much for bearing with us on that. Mike.
Thanks, Chair. That's been a really good session, I think. Just in your process, Ian, is somebody from the academic community part of that? I mean, there's a lot of research stuff, ideas that have come out of these discussions, and I just wonder whether we don't want to engage with them before you produce the final document.
So I think that's good. I think what we might do, I mean, Andreas was actually, unfortunately, he's not still with us. He had to drop off, but I think what we might do is draw on Andreas's thinking as chair of the academic advisory group. I mean, obviously we've got members of that amongst the board, Tricia and Scott anyway. But I think you're right, because I think one of the things we do as a board need to just reflect on is this question about, do we actually go out with a proposed sort of program of research topics, as it were, or how do we handle that? And you know, so yeah, I think you're right. That's a good point. Thanks for that. Any other points anybody wants to make? Great. Okay. Well, I think we're there now. So thank you very much, everyone, for all that input. You know, and thanks very much as well to Leah and Vanessa for making the technology work. There was that sort of moment when everybody disappeared off into their rooms, and you know, you just hope that it's all going to work at that point in time, and it clearly has. And thanks to the staff supporting the chairs in terms of giving us that feedback. I think that was you know, excellent. Well done on you know, pulling those feedback summaries together. So with that, we come to the end of today's session. We have the next session on Tuesday. We will see, so the first item on that agenda is the conceptual framework. We will see back an updated project brief on the retirement benefit plans, and we will also carry on a bit with the discussion that we sort of were in the middle of in terms of revenue. It looks like, talking to Ross yesterday, we won't have time to go further with natural resources at this meeting, but we got some clear pointers on that and instructions to staff on that. If you have further comments on the papers, either the drafting or matters of principle that we didn't get to where you wanted to raise comments, please can you direct those back to staff so that they can take that forward and we get the right papers for the June meeting. And there will be a first draft of the decisions and instructions from this meeting. Ross, do you want to add anything to that summary in terms of what we'll be picking up on Tuesday?
Just to say on the decisions and instructions, we'll work to finalize those today for the discussions this far from staff, and we've got to check in with task force chairs on those outcomes where applicable, and then we'll probably circulate those at some point on Monday. So you'll have them before the Tuesday session.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Okay, great. Well done, everyone. I think we've had 4 very good days of discussion this week. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's been great in terms of the level of input from the board as a whole. I think you know, everybody's intervened at all the, you know, across the various different discussions, and that feels really good and healthy in terms of the board. And well done to the 3 new board members for stepping right in to begin with and giving us some great input. It's a bit intimidating when you first arrive in the board, so I think I'd just sort of say great, well done on that. So have a good weekend, everybody. Well earned, I think, and see you all on Tuesday.